Welcome to the New Books Network.
My name is Maria Lipman. I'm the editor of Russia Post, a website published by the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, and I also write capsule reviews of Russia-related books for the Foreign Affairs. It is my great pleasure today to speak with Susan Grunewald, the author of From Incarceration to Repatriation, German Prisoners of War in the Soviet Union, published by Cornell University Press in 2024. Hi, Susan. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
So maybe let's start with why you picked this topic and what your major sources were. Apparently, German prisoners, many of them went back and left memoirs, and maybe their families too had memories that they probably recorded. What else?
Sure. So for the first question about how I got into this, the year after college, I was a Fulbright English teaching assistant to Ulyanovsk, Lenin's hometown in still European Russia on the Volga River. Migration control is important in Russia. You have to register your visa and register your domicile and things like that. And the university has a main campus in the northern part of the city, but the building at the time where the visa paperwork was processed was on Karl Marx Street. And I went in one day to submit my documents, and the woman there asked me what I thought of the building. And I was a little bit puzzled and just a very lovely building. I don't know how to respond to this question. And she told me that the building had been built by German prisoners of war. And she went on and on about the quality of the building and how much better it was because the Germans had built it. And I was quite puzzled because I knew that the fighting had not been that close to Ulyanovsk, and I was confused as to why and how German prisoners of war had built this building for them. And so that's what started me on this quest of researching this topic. I realized that there was not that much written about it pretty much nothing written about it in English. A few things written in German, but not that much besides memoirs, as you pointed out. And also not that much published about it in Russian scholarship as well. And so when I went down the rabbit hole of going to graduate school for Soviet history, discussing with potential advisors and things like that, we determined that this would be a good topic for a PhD project. And it seems to have worked out because there's a book out of it and everything. As for sources, I relied on a lot of different ones. Memoirs from the men who returned. There are a lot of sources that were as of 2016, 2017, when I was doing the bulk of my research in the Russian Federation. There were a lot of resources that had been declassified and were accessible in a variety of state archives. I used sources in a few different German archives. I've found sources in collections in American archives. The Hoover Institution, for example, had a couple of surprising collections related to my topic. Newspaper articles published in a variety of East and West German newspapers. And then I also did a little bit of mapping research and analysis to sort of fill some holes in the archival sources or the memoir literature.
Right. We'll get to mapping a little later, I think. It is really an interesting part of your book. But let's probably talk about how many prisoners are we talking about? How many German prisoners of war was there at the end of World War II in 1945? And where were they kept?
Sure. So at surrender, May 1945, Soviet officials had about 3 million Germans in captivity. And that's the Germans. That's not necessarily also Austrians, Romanians, other Axis powers, and so on and so forth. By December of 1945, Soviet authorities state that they have 1.5 million men in captivity. So in those, 7-ish months, about half of the men in captivity are either released or they had died. The death statistics are very complicated for a variety of reasons. I don't think we'll ever be able to get the true number. Scholars diverge wildly about these numbers. So I don't want to comment on it because I don't think it's possible to accurately comment on it, but certainly not all of those 1.5 million were repatriated, but I don't think it was that 1.5 million of them died at the time. And then these men are released in phases up into 1956. The question of where they were held throughout all of the Soviet Union, with the exception of Tajikistan. I don't know why Tajikistan did not have any, but that was the one republic that did not have any German prisoners of war. But the vast majority of them were housed in the European parts of the Soviet Union. So what is that? West of the Urals. It's not like the vast majority of them were in Siberia, for example.
Right. And how does it compare to the number of prisoners seized by the Allies at that time?
So the other allies actually held more German prisoners of war at the end of the war. I think the number is something like 11 million total Germans in captivity around the end of the war. So if there are 3 million or 3 million and change in Soviet captivity, that means the remaining, my math is not my strong suit, 7-8 million roughly are in the hands of the other allied powers at the same time. So in theory, more than double held by the other allies.
And they were apparently Soviet POWs held by the Germans.
Yes.
To the end of the war. Was there ever, what was the procedure? Of course, Germany capitulated, was totally conquered. What happened to the Soviet prisoners of war who ended up in Germany at the end of the war, and how was there any connection between the two processes, the treatment of German POWs in the Soviet Union and what was happening to the Soviet POWs in Germany?
So there were vastly different treatments for the two groups in the opposing countries. At least initially, German plans for the Soviets who were captured by the Germans were subjected to really bad treatment. The Soviet plan was one of extermination, often through hunger. So a camp could quite literally just be an open field with barbed wire around it. And the Soviets who were in captivity were left to starve to death. Or they were summarily executed upon capture, and other ones were the first test subjects for Zyklon B gas. And then it was determined that it was effective and then was later implemented in the Holocaust. I didn't delve too deeply into the comparative numbers or statistics. Certainly there were Soviet soldiers in captivity at the end of the war. I assume that they were then sent back relatively quickly to the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet officials did a vast filtration process of those who had been held captive. I know some of them were considered suspicious elements, and many of them, I believe, were sent to the Gulag after the war. Per the terms of the Geneva Convention or the Hague Convention, these earlier conventions concerning treatment of prisoners of war, which the Soviet Union did not necessarily uphold, but the Nazi officials also did not necessarily uphold them. Upon surrender, you're supposed to return your captive men, right? Or surrender. As soon as the war is concluded, both sides are supposed to swap their prisoners. Towards the end of the war, at the various conferences, Yalta, Tehran, and then later Potsdam, the Allies agreed that it was acceptable to hold on to German prisoners of war for a certain amount of time after the war. They all agreed that December 31st, 1948 was to be the cutoff date. Because of the extent and the damages of the war, it was fair to continue to use German captives for some aspects of reconstruction or rebuilding, or in farming or certain other aspects of industry. It didn't have to necessarily be physical reconstruction of things that were destroyed. And then
we will return to December 48 and whether countries actually met this deadline.
Did that or not? Yeah.
But apparently that was the international agreement, because at that time the Soviet Union was still an ally of Great Britain and the United States, and that was the agreement. We will see what happened to the agreement, but let's get to what you write about a lot in your book, the treatment of German POWs in the Soviet Union. So, given the horrendous brutality, and you've just said some things about it, the starvation camps where Soviet POWs were actually destined to die of hunger, summary executions of civilian population. Many Soviet people were deported to Germany to work as forced laborers. Of course, the territory of the Soviet Union was devastated, large part of it. And the Soviet Union, will remind, lost 27 million people in that war. So you would expect that the treatment of German prisoners in the Soviet Union would be guided by revenge. So what was the case in fact?
It really was not necessarily revenge. Certainly, there is an air of punishment, right, if you continue to detain the men after the war. But in reality, Soviet officials were just so concerned with reconstruction after the vast damages of the war that they did try to take as best care as they could have, to a certain degree, these men, because they needed them for labor and reconstruction. As you just pointed out, 27 million Soviet citizens were killed during the war, so there was an immense labor shortage. Soviet officials consciously chose to harness the power of the able-bodied, right? Those who physically could labor, German prisoners of war, labored. Right after surrender, right, those first 7-ish months, there are waves of repatriations. This is Soviet officials trying to release men who could not physically sustain labor. Anybody who was ill or injured, those were the ones who were allowed to be repatriated basically when the war ended, because Soviet officials had little interest in expending precious resources on maintaining the health of those men. The Soviet officials had decades of experience through forced labor camp systems with the Gulag, which was really established and created in 1929. They had done these gruesome calculations to figure out basically the minimum amount of food you could feed somebody to sustain the person to continue to perform at a certain labor output level. So these men were evaluated on regular intervals, I believe it was monthly, to check their physical status. Are you able of performing 8 hours of hard labor? Okay, you remain in that status. Are you suddenly a little bit weaker? You're downgraded to performing only 6 hours or 4 hours of hard labor. Are you weaker than that? Then you're going to perform a few hours of light labor around a camp or something like that. There were procedures for trying to rehabilitate those men in smaller amounts, like shorter-term rehabilitation. If you could have a short-term rehabilitation of slightly better rations to then return to peak physical form, to then produce more labor, there was some interest in that. Now, these are also official directives that ordered things like this. It's not always that the reality was able to match the directives of Soviet officials. Again, partially due to the destruction of the war, right? You had a famine in the Soviet Union in 1946, 1947. Free Soviet citizens were starving. So these German captives who were lower on the central provisioning order suffered as a result of that as well. But you also had free Soviet citizens suffering from disease, suffering from lack of housing. And so it shows that Soviet officials were conscious it was not necessarily punishment, because everybody in the country was at such a poor level of material quality of life and so on and so forth, right? Soviet Union loses a quarter of its total physical assets during World War II. So it physically just cannot provide to everybody who needs it.
Still, quite a few of German prisoners died, especially during the war. And you're
Yes.
writing about that. And I think one moment when a lot of them died was following the Battle of Stalingrad. So this is before, apparently, they started to be used, German prisoners started to be used for construction or for other reconstruction in the Soviet Union. But the number of German prisoners who died after Stalingrad was immense, wasn't it?
Yes.
And why was that? I mean, why especially at that moment? And how the treatment back then changed when the war was over?
Okay, so there are a couple of reasons for the really high death rates, especially around Stalingrad. One is that it has to do with just the trajectory and course of the war itself. So Stalingrad, like Battle of Moscow, is a victory, right? The Nazis are not able to conquer the city of Moscow, but it's not a resounding major victory in the sense that there are not massive sweeping changes in the fighting after that. The Soviets are still fighting very defensively. This changes at Stalingrad, right? After Stalingrad, so the Red Army switches more so from defensive fighting to offensive fighting. They're going to reclaim territories that they had. So prior to Stalingrad, the Red Army is not capturing a mass number of Germans. There are only a few thousands of them. We're not talking massive numbers of them taken. As soon as the Battle of Stalingrad is over, there's a massive influx. So the system of camps is not there. It's not ready to accept that many soldiers all at once. There are similar conditions in the Gulag camp system where you see very high mortality rates when the camp system expands far too quickly, much faster than anticipated. There are not the resources ready to give to these men. There are not the shelters ready to give to these men. Another reason why a lot of the Stalingrad captives die is just because of the winter and the fighting of the war itself, the battle itself, the progress of the war. The commander at Stalingrad Palace was given multiple opportunities to surrender over the span of a couple of months. The soldiers were encircled for a couple of months. They were not getting the supplies and rations that they needed. So as German officials stalled the surrender, the physical quality of the men was weaker and weaker and weaker, right? Because they were cold, they were starving, they didn't have adequate rations. So these men who were captured were in very, very, very poor physical standing. And for many of them, it was something that they could not recover from, even in captivity.
Right, but even so, many captives died, but this was not an act of revenge. As far as I understand from your book, it was more the result of negligence and unpreparedness for dealing with such gigantic numbers suddenly of German prisoners in the Soviet Union.
If anything, at most it's certainly negligence and ambivalence, but less so a sense of we need to exterminate them or kill them in retaliation for what they have done to our captives. It was a lot of complicated factors happening all at once. Should Soviet authorities have recognized that they were offering surrender multiple times, the men were encircled, should they have recognized that they would be getting thousands of men? Yes. Did they plan for that? No.
Yeah. So let's get back to how they were used for the post-war reconstruction. I'm not old enough to remember POWs, their presence in the Soviet Union. What I do remember as a kid, however, is my parents showing me buildings in Moscow and telling me, oh, those were built by the Germans, pretty much like the story that you were telling about your experience in Ulyanovsk.
Yeah.
So, but apparently construction alone was but one out of many ways those prisoners were used. Could you please talk about that?
Yeah, so they were dispersed throughout all the variety they were commissariats before a certain date, ministries after another date of the Soviet economy. They worked in construction, they worked in coal mining, they worked in power plant building or maintenance. They worked in the aviation industry. They worked in a variety of mechanical industries, heavy industry, construction of steel mills, other extractive industries like timber. A small number of them worked in agriculture. They worked, I think there was something like, I forget the exact number of ministries or commissariats, but they worked in all but one or two of them. So they were in every major sector of the Soviet economy in a variety of different numbers, right? Concentrations, percentages. In some industries, they made up, I think it was something about a quarter of the total workforce in one of the industries. So they were everywhere. They were everywhere where labor was needed. Labor was needed everywhere, so that makes sense. But they were primarily assigned in the biggest numbers to industries that would help with reconstruction, not just construction, like building new homes that were damaged or building new factories that were damaged, but also the industries that were the foundations and building blocks of the economy more broadly, right? Steel production, coal making, timber, peat, and so on and so forth.
Right. What I found very striking in your book was this list, apparently coming from the archives of various Soviet agencies, and they're what I if I remember correctly, were their requirements or their requests
Yes.
for workforce and specifically POWs. I think in the book you use the word loan, that Soviet institutions, Soviet ministries and other agencies actually loaned workforce from Gulag camps. So if that was indeed the system, and I hope you will talk a little bit more about that. This apparently meant that German prisoners contacted with Soviet people, Soviet prisoners, maybe Gulag prisoners, or maybe even people who were not prisoners, people who were free. So how was, and we're talking about a country devastated by the war. Do you have any idea of how those contacts were perceived by both sides?
Sure. So yeah, the prisoners were assigned to a camp. A camp would be in the vicinity of a city or a village. It might be a branch camp. And then those local, let's call them regional camp officials, then engaged in contracts with local industries and assigned the labor of these prisoners of war out on loan to local industries, right? So there'd be a factory, for example, in the outskirts of Moscow, and that factory would write to one of the local Moscow camp leaders and say, I need workers, I need 1,000 workers, send me 1,000 workers. And the camp would write back, we don't have 1,000 workers, but we can send you 500. Or the factories were so desperate for labor, they would even say, I don't care if somebody is ill, right? If he is a weaker labor category, I will take prisoners who are in ill health. If they can work for 4 hours a day or 3 hours a day, that's still 4 or 3 hours of production that I'm getting rather than 0 hours of production. That was the extent of the labor crisis in the Soviet Union after the war. And the camp officials tried to give out the prisoners. They only had so many that they had that they could assign to local industries. These labor contracts then would also determine some of the conditions for the prisoners, right? If a industry site was too far away from the camp, I should say, factories were often tasked with providing transportation for the prisoners who were on loan. If they're outside of a certain range, I guess if it took too many hours to transport them back and forth, the local industries were required to provide dormitories for these workers. I've not been able to substantiate it, but there are even rumors, right? You're talking about Moscow and the construction of Moscow. Stalin's Seven Sisters skyscrapers are some of the most iconic buildings in Moscow. One of them is the main building for Moscow State University. And the urban legend is that the prisoners contributed to the construction of this building, and that instead of going back to the camps at night, they lived on different floors of the skyscraper as it was being constructed. There may actually be truth to this. It seems like if a variety of different cities all have a common story like that, probably there's some truth to it, right? It wouldn't be that 1,000 different locations in Russia all have the same story if it didn't contain some kernel of truth. So there was a variety of mixing of these prisoners and free Soviet citizens as well on job sites because of the labor shortage. There may have been concerns, but from leadership about the potential tainting of the Soviet workforce, right? Because the enemies were there. But it seems that on a general personal level, if you read the memoirs of the German prisoners of war, or you read memoirs of Soviet citizens at the time, or even just if you're speaking with people, stories that were passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, it seems like there was an understanding that, yes, these men had contributed to destruction of the Soviet Union, but it wasn't necessarily on a personal hatred level when they met the individuals. They could extract the individual soldier from the heinous acts or ideology of Nazism.
Yeah, this sounds pretty remarkable, isn't it? And talking about the legend about the Moscow State University building being built by the Germans, that's what I heard too.
Yeah.
And of course, there is no evidence for it, but this was what people were talking about. There was an interesting point in your book about German POWs sometimes being treated even better than Soviet Gulag prisoners because they were not a renewable resource. Can you please say what you meant by that? And this is, again, pretty remarkable, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the unique aspects of being a German prisoner of war in the Soviet Union as opposed to a domestic prisoner within the Soviet Union. The POW camp system was heavily modeled on the Gulag camp system. It borrowed a lot of the same norms for, say, rations or medical treatment. But there was some understanding, at least in the post-war period especially, that these men would return home eventually, right? They were not meant to be there forever. In the initial period after the war, these Germans served as a ready labor force to fix some of the labor shortage. As the Soviet economy continued to recover after the war, after Red Army soldiers were demobilized and could go home to work in the factories, as the Gulag population increased in size with post-war war crimes trials processes, filtration, looking for enemies, again, some of the paranoia that you saw during the terror before the war, the Gulag population increases. So if the Soviet economy relies on a certain amount of forced labor, and the Gulag population was decimated during the war due to a variety of reasons, the Gulag population is low, but the German prisoner of war population is high after the war. So these German prisoners can sort of fill that gap in the forced labor market, or sector, excuse me. As these men continue to as the Germans either die in captivity or return for a variety of reasons, their population dwindles. But the Gulag population starts to increase again after the war with increased arrests. So the reliance on forced labor is still there. It's just a different subsect of the population who's being used in forced labor. And the reliance on forced labor is also, again, it changes over time as more and more younger men are demobilized and return from the military to fill those positions in the economy as well. So there's distinct change over time in who is important, how, and why. The Germans also received slightly better treatment than Soviet prisoners, again, partially because now there are a variety of debates about why it did not happen. The Soviet Union did not sign the Geneva Conventions. Excuse me. They created their own rule for the treatment of prisoners. They called it the Provision on Prisoners of War. It largely was modeled on the Geneva Conventions. It met a lot of the same terms. One of the things that was different was segregation based on race, right? The Soviet Union didn't believe in that, for example. So that was one claim that they made as to why they didn't sign the Geneva Convention. Soviet officials did try to provision their German captives with slightly better rations, right? You're supposed to provide men the same rations based on their rank. You're supposed to provide captive men the same rations based on their rank as you would to men in your own army, right? So officers are given a certain amount of better treatment. Enlisted men are given a certain amount of rations and treatment. There were directives from Soviet officials that seemed to model this, right? The rations were not great, again, because captive Germans were supposed to get less than Red Army soldiers fighting, which sort of makes sense, right? You want your Red Army soldiers to be provisioned the best in society. The captives, you want to be able to sustain them, but you don't want to treat them particularly well because they are enemy captives. After the war, there were attempts, and seemingly memoir literature corroborates this, there were increases in the rations in various periods of time after the war as the economy started to stabilize, as resources were redistributed to citizens while the war was not fighting. Enlisted German captives had to do hard labor, heavy labor, forced labor. Captive German officers didn't have to perform manual labor, for example. So there were matches there. And it seems that the ration norms for German soldiers, captive, were potentially better than certain free sectors of the Soviet society as well, right? So if you were working in a factory, you got, as a free Soviet citizen, right, especially if it was for defense purposes, you got the highest rations possible. If you were a child, if you were elderly, you were not working in a factory, you got lower rations. So it seems that the calorie content of the rations for German captives who were performing labor would have been higher than the calorie content of rations of a child, free Soviet citizen. Now, again, what happened in reality and the orders of above did not always match, but that was also common in the Soviet Union, even when they were not at war, looking at the industrialization campaign in the 1920s and 30s, for example.
Indeed. Let us then talk about life in those camps for POWs. So apparently the main raison d'etre for keeping them and for feeding them and for preventing them from dying was that they could be used as labor force.
Yes.
But it was not all about labor. And there were different aspects of life in the camps that I would like you to talk about. But first, what about communication with their families? Did they try, or were they allowed to? More importantly, were they allowed to look for their families, try to communicate? And apparently there were attempts, this is after the war already, there were attempts from Germany to look for their loved ones who they hoped were not killed in the Eastern Front, but maybe ended up in captivity. So could you please talk about that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of complicated factors going on here that also relate to the fact that the Soviets and Germans didn't recognize the Geneva Convention towards each other. The Soviet Union was also incredibly mistrustful of the Red Cross, partially due to things that happened during the Russian Civil War. So the Red Cross was not allowed in, for example, to inspect Soviet camps. Because the Geneva Convention was not signed or respected between the two countries, the Nazis and the Soviets, there were not published lists of those who are in captivity. Right. So if you have a man and he's captured, you're supposed to notify the country, hey, Rolf has been captured. He is in this camp. His family is supposed to have the right to send small postcards through the Red Cross to communicate. That wasn't happening during the war years. It takes a little bit of time, but after the war is over, German citizens in what becomes East and West Germany do obtain the right to correspond with their loved ones in camps. And vice versa, right? The men in camps are allowed to send small postcards home. The postcards are censored. They're only supposed to be given a certain amount of characters. It's basically supposed to be enough to say, hello, I am alive. I am okay. Don't worry. And then the Germans then are allowed to eventually send packages over. So they'll send care packages of food or reading materials, again, things that would be censored, but food would get through them. And there are a lot of stories or returnees were interviewed upon their return to Germany by a variety of different organizations, government organizations, the Catholic Relief Organization, the Protestant Relief Organization. And in these returnee interviews, they would say things like, yes, the packages got through to me. I'm extraordinarily grateful for them. The rations meant a lot. They helped sort of sustain me, kept me going on top of what I was given in captivity in the Soviet Union. Not everybody was given the right to correspond. If you were tried and convicted of a war crime in the Soviet Union, you were not allowed to correspond home, right? That was a term of your punishment. But there was a lot of mystery surrounding who was in the camps, again, because the Soviets didn't release official records of who they had. Complicating this was that Nazi officials intentionally downplayed the number of deaths that were happening on the war front. So a lot of men were labeled as missing in action when they were potentially killed and known that they were killed. Nazi officials, especially in the last couple of months of the war, did not want to create panic, distrust in the war. They didn't want the civilian population to give up on the war. And so they intentionally withheld some of this information as well. There's also just the chaos of the fighting, right? Not everybody was properly recorded if they were killed or missing or taken captive. And so a lot of families in Germany didn't know what had happened to their relatives. And obviously a lot of them held out the hope that they were in Soviet captivity rather than that they had been killed. And so there were a lot of attempts to find out who was in captivity. Because there were no official lists of the captives, the returnees were heavily interrogated. So they were asked if they were released, if somebody was sick or injured. There's one memoir account, a guy was working in a timber industry, a tree fell and crushed his foot, broke his foot. He got sent home because he had a broken foot. These men would be asked, can you name any of the names of the men who were with you? And do you have any additional information, right? What was his name? Do you know where he was from? Do you know what unit he served in? And then that way, German officials would try to cross-reference and figure out off of the missing lists. There were also photo albums, faces of men and names of who had been missing, and they were asked, do you recognize any of these faces, any of these names, to help us figure out, are they indeed missing? Are they indeed killed? Are they indeed in Soviet captivity? So there are a lot of informal exchanges that way.
Right. And about that's really, really interesting. And the fact that the Soviet Union did not sign, or actually was not part of Geneva Convention by the time it was the Soviet Union, and still actually was considerate of and actually was following some of the points and provisions of the Geneva Convention. So I would like you to talk a little bit about what life was like on top of course, very heavy, very hard labor. It was
Right.
not all about hard labor.
No, labor was the biggest part of it, but there were attempts to do things like recreation or re-education. And often things that we think of as recreation, right, just ways to keep the men sort of busy in the hours that they were not working, were often ways to also try to re-educate the captives. So they would be exposed to a lot of camp newspapers, where they would be invited to participate in diary or photo album making projects, in which they were asked sort of to reflect on their experience and sort of echo or re-amplify certain Soviet values. They would see theater performances, they would watch a lot of film reels, again, with a heavy emphasis on re-education. And by re-education, I mean, basically, these are the tenets of these are the tenets of National Socialism. This is why this is bad. This is why this is why Weimar collapsed. This is how you got this insidious ideology, and this is where it was wrong. These are the tenets of Soviet socialism. You might have been taught that, or you certainly were taught in Nazi Germany, that it was bad for X, Y, and Z reasons. This is why this was wrong, right? As you can see, we did not summarily execute you upon capture. As you can see, we don't torture people. As you can see, we try to provide quality of life to all of our citizens, right? We're going to re-educate you in what it means to be a good socialist, and we're going to re-educate you in what it means to be a good Soviet socialist worker, so that you will hopefully not have the same fear of the Soviet Union. So if and when you are repatriated, you will be an ally of the Soviet Union, and you will not attack again another time. You will not be as fearful or mistrustful of the ideology or Stalin's government after having seen it firsthand, and after having been exposed to some of the cultural productions of it, right? Seeing some of the movies, for example, I mean by cultural productions, or reading translations of Soviet newspapers into German, or reading translations of Soviet or even Russian literature works in German.
Which raises the issue of the language. In what language did that re-education process go? And especially since you mentioned movies, I can understand there probably were instructors, or I don't know, ideology instructors and translators maybe, or those Soviets who could speak German to the German captives. But well, still, this ideological production was originally in Russian. So how did the language issue, how was it resolved? And another question is, as time went on, and as we know, Germany was divided, and the four sectors became two Germanys.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually. So how did that factor in how those German captives were treated, and what happened to them afterwards? And were they, when they returned, were they returned to the region where they came from?
Mm-hmm.
Did the Soviet Union try to send everyone to East Germany? What was the tactics here?
Okay, so first I'll tackle the re-education, sort of, let's call it the propaganda wing for the German prisoners of war when they're in captivity. There were obviously Soviet citizens who had studied German. They worked for various propaganda agitation departments within the Soviet Union, what had been the Comintern, the Communist International. People who had been working for them created materials for these German captives. There were also a large number of German communists and socialists who had fled to the Soviet Union after the Nazis took power in 1933. These men worked to create these anti-fascist materials for the German captives. Initially, during the war, they created materials that were attempted to sway the Germans to surrender, to overthrow the Hitler regime. Once the war is over, then these materials shift to becoming allies with the Soviet Union and becoming more accepting of or even championing socialism or communism in Germany. Many of these men, such as Walter Ulbricht or Wilhelm Pieck, they're going to go back to Germany after the end of the war, and they're going to become leading officials in what becomes East Germany. There were also other German captives, primarily officers, but not necessarily always officers, who were sympathetic towards either the causes of overthrowing Hitlerism or becoming socialist after the war. They also helped to produce these ideological materials in German language. They helped to produce courses, and then certain prisoners within Germany, within the Soviet Union, would go to these courses, or they would become leaders in these courses and educate other German prisoners of war. So the idea was to give some of this ideological content in the native language to these men. They should have been exposed to at least a small amount of it. And some of them went to very, very intensive courses to become specially trained propaganda and agitation I'm trying to think of the word. To work for propaganda and agitation causes in all of Germany, right? So this goes to your second question, which was, where did the men go when they were released? You're supposed to go to the part of Germany where you came from, right? If you were from, I don't know, Bavaria, you would go back to Bavaria. If you're from Stuttgart, you'd go back to Stuttgart. If you were from Berlin, you would go to the part of Berlin that you were from, based on your residence prior to the start of the war. There was not a preference or an attempt to send more men to what becomes East Germany versus West Germany. In fact, more men end up going back to what becomes West Germany than East Germany. There is not an attempt to favor releases over time. So the majority of the men go to East Germany in 1947 versus 48. No, there's nothing like that. There were attempts. Generally, men were repatriated with respect to their physical condition or lack thereof. But certain men were repatriated after taking these intensive propaganda courses. And there were attempts to situate these men in important roles in East and West Germany. In East Germany, we can track it. Yes, these men went back. They became part of the police force. They became part of the government. They became school teachers, and so on and so forth, right? As part of the denazification campaign in the Soviet territories. There were attempts to place men in these same roles in what becomes West Germany, but the trail of them is lost upon repatriation, right? I wasn't able to find similar types of records of who they were and what they did after they returned. Some of these men clearly became committed socialists, committed, champions for Soviet-German friendship. Some of these men, if you read the literature, the memoir literature, were just looking out for their own survival. So there's one who said, I recognized that going to the intensive re-education campaign was my way to sit in a classroom all day for a few weeks and not perform hard labor. I recognized that they wanted me to quote back Marx and Lenin and Stalin to them with glee and enthusiasm, and I did. And as soon as I got repatriated, I threw that all out the window and went back to living my life in what became West Germany. So there is probably both, right? There are people who truly began to believe in it, and there are other people, human nature saw it as their means to survival and did that as well.
And some benefited, apparently, from what you say, in the GDR, in East Germany, right?
Yes, that was a way to get a good position upon return, right? If you were re-educated and you got a position of not extreme power, but you got a civil service job, that was a good, reliable job for you to have.
Would you mention one figure that actually stands apart in his importance? Marshal Paulus, the marshal who was taken prisoner after Stalingrad, after Russia's victory in the Stalingrad battle. And what was his fate?
So again, he's the leader of the forces at Stalingrad. He's captured. He's one of the most high-profile captives. Hitler apparently threw a fit that Paulus allowed himself to be taken captive, that he did not kill himself. It was a major victory for the Soviets on that propaganda front. In his time in captivity, he actually became a committed socialist. He came from the part of what was supposed to be West Germany, or what becomes West Germany. But Paulus writes in captivity, you know, I've reflected on my times, I've learned about all of this. I am a socialist now. I want to go to East Germany. He writes to the Soviet officials and says, please release me to East Germany. I want to be part of the construction of East German socialism. I have no singular document that says, no, don't release him. It seemingly goes to Stalin. And arbitrarily, Stalin seems to want to keep him in captivity, does not want to do this, right? Other Soviet officials, top leading officials, are writing to Stalin and they say, this could be a major propaganda victory for us if he goes back to East Germany and fights for German socialism. Paulus remains in captivity. Stalin dies. After Stalin's death, he is allowed to be released, and he does indeed go to East Germany, becomes an official in East Germany, and works for the rest of his life to really fight for East German socialism and Soviet-German friendship. And so he's one of these really unique stories that it is very improbable, but perhaps it was because of his kid, right? He probably assumed, I am a marshal, I'm going to be tried, I'm going to be executed, right? This is what Nazi propaganda has told me. I have been taken into captivity. I am not being treated poorly. I am an officer, so I am at a relatively nicer camp outside of Moscow. I'm treated well. I'm being educated. It seems that there is truth to what the Soviets are telling me. He's one person where it worked out.
Amazing. So you mentioned that he was only released after Stalin's death, but Stalin's death is 1953. And as you mentioned earlier, and as you're writing in the book, actually there was an agreement, the agreement made by the Allies, by the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain, that German captives, German prisoners of war should be released by the end of December 48. Apparently
Yes.
they were not, or not all of them. So how many, do you have an assessment of how many of them remained there in the Soviet Union at the end of 48, and why? What was the rationale for Stalin not to release them?
Okay, so again, the numbers are very hazy and fuzzy. There's not there's a great document with full accountings in 45, 46, 47. That same level of document, if it exists, it wasn't declassified and accessible the same way. I did see some repatriation files over the 40s, late 40s, 50s. They're not always in perfect order. They're in a way that mathematically you can't put all the pieces together and get the total for the year, right? There'll be a quarterly report and then one of the quarters will be missing. There'll be some monthly reports, but you'll only have 4 months out of 12, something like that. The Soviet officials make a variety of announcements, especially after starting January 1949, about the numbers they have. And then there'll be repatriation statistics. And so they'll say, oh, we only have 5,000 men awaiting return, right? They are ill. They're not suitable for transport. We're not just going to stick them on a train to have them die. They need to be stabilized before they can be sent home, things like that. And they say, we only have this many men awaiting repatriation. And then suddenly a train will appear in Germany, and that train will have more than that number of men on it. And it will happen a few months in a row. And so the East and West Germans will say, okay, but how many do you really have? Because if you say you only have 5,000 men and a train shows up on April 1st with 6,000 men, you definitely have more than 5,000 men. So I've run into that problem trying to figure out it's kind of frustrating, the math of that. But this goes back to the question of December 31st, 1948. All the Allies agree, we will return our German prisoners of war by this date. The US returns their men, I think, in 46, the British in 47, and the French have to be pressured by the Americans and the British to actually return their captives by December 31st. They grudgingly do it. The Soviets, come January of 1949, they say, oh, we don't have German prisoners of war anymore. We have war convicts or war criminals. So they use a linguistic shift, right? Because you are allowed to keep war criminals. You are allowed to detain them. They're not a regular prisoner of war. They have committed atrocities. They've committed crimes. It is in your right to continue to incarcerate or prosecute them. Not all of these men who are held after 1948, though, are war criminals. That isn't to say that there weren't any, right? There were serious war criminals in Soviet captivity. We know that. There were mass atrocities, but not all of the men held after January were war criminals. It seems that there were a lot of vague trials that were held, and so there were just like broad articles, crimes against the Soviet Union slapped on these men. They were basically guilty of association, guilty of just being German soldiers captured by the Soviets. And so this causes tensions in the Cold War, understandably. This also causes problems for East Germany. East Germany has to follow basically the official Soviet line, right? So the Soviets say it's only war criminals. The East Germans say, great, they're war criminals. We accept that these were bad men. But then some of them return. And so this messes with the narrative for the East German government, because then suddenly, if these men were war criminals, how do you reintegrate them into society? You can't celebrate their return. West Germany also sort of grapples with this. Depending on the political stance and the spectrum of, say, the newspaper reporting on this coverage, it will say like, our men are home, thank goodness. It's published on the first page, the names of the men, anytime that there's a repatriation transport. Other newspapers will use more neutral language, right? Ones that were very critical or negative of the Nazi past will say things like, the men are home, but it won't use a war criminal word. It won't use a prisoner word term. And some of them are outright, again, condescending, right? Like, we don't like the Nazis, we shouldn't celebrate these men, and so on and so forth. So there's a vast range across both Germanys, how to integrate these men, how to look at these men, how to deal with these men. Regardless, both German governments want their family members home, and they try to champion and articulate for it.
Right. So Stalin was playing these diplomatic games, if that's the way to describe them. Stalin dies in March 1953. And as you're writing in the book, this is one of, I think you named three important factors why the process of returning German captives to Germany accelerated after Stalin's death. So his death alone was a factor. What were the two others?
Well, so his death, right? There are amnesties of the Gulag. A lot of this then causes shifts in domestic and international Soviet politics. And so the men jockeying for control of the Soviet Union after Stalin used the German prisoners of war to sort of help their political goals. So again, Beria launches an amnesty of Gulag prisoners after Stalin's death. He wants to come across as more of a reformer than Stalin, which is not the case, but he uses this for public perception. And this applies to the German prisoners as well. A small contingent of German prisoners of war are released in these amnesties. A few months later, there's a major political crisis in East Germany. There's a massive workers' uprising. It starts in Berlin in June of 1953. It spreads throughout the country. Soviet tanks literally come in and crush the protesters, and the East German government just narrowly holds on to control, again, through basically Soviet force. After this, the Soviet officials decide to release a number of German prisoners of war to both East and West Germany, right? They want this to be seen as a victory of the East German government. The East German government claims that they articulated to the Soviet officials that they fought for, they really worked to get this release of prisoners. So this should be a victory for them and something that should inspire confidence of the German people in the East German regime. Then we fast forward a few years later to 1955. Khrushchev is really in charge of the Soviet Union by this point. And he sees the prisoners as a means to secure some of his other motives, right? So in 54, 55, West Germany joins NATO, and this terrifies the Soviet leaders. They're worried, right? It's already known that West Germany is in the Western sphere of influence, but now they're in a military alliance. Khrushchev invites Adenauer, the leader of West Germany, to the Soviet Union to try to improve relations, right? Officially, the West German government doesn't recognize the East German government. Officially, the Soviet Union doesn't recognize the West German government. It says it only recognizes the East German government. And so Khrushchev says, come to the Soviet Union. We're going to work on negotiations. I want to fully normalize relations. we will recognize your government. You can have, a consulate, and all that, or embassy, all that stuff. But we have to work on a few issues. Adenauer, before he goes to the Soviet Union, says he will not formalize relations unless the last men are returned. He makes that one of his points, his ultimatums. There are a few days of tense negotiations in Moscow in September of 1955, and Khrushchev finally relents and says, fine, I will send the men back. It is far more important for the greater international goals of the Soviet Union and sort of trying to lessen tensions in the burgeoning Cold War within Europe to return these men. So he says, fine, the last men can return. The repatriations start over the fall and early winter of 1955, and the last men go back in January of 1956. So while they were held, initially after the war for economic reasons, they become more so political pawns in the Cold War, and Khrushchev releases the last of them to further his ideas for how Soviet international relations should go in Europe.
Right. So I think this takes us to my last question. So January 56, right, is when it seems the last German prisoner returns back home. However, for the families of those Germans who did not return, I think many of them still had hopes that maybe my brother, husband, son is still there somewhere in captivity. And the only way to reassure them, well, if maybe not the right word, but at least for them to know exactly what happened to their loved ones, would be access to the records. And as far as I understand, the Soviet Union, through the very end of its existence in 91, never gave access to Germany to the records that it kept. So when was there the first opportunity for the families to at least, of course, they could not believe the records as well, but at least access to the records seems to give you the information about your loved one that you're supposed to trust.
Yeah. So there was a massive declassification campaign in the former Soviet, the centralized archives, and housed in what becomes the Russian Federation after the Soviet collapse. Once this happens, various German individuals and organizations, such as the German Red Cross, ask the Russians for access to, say, death statistics, things like that, or information about cemetery records. And Russian officials are partially swayed to release some of this information because they want there was an agreement between the reunified German government and the Russian Federation in the early 90s so that Russia could continue to maintain its war graves and monuments on German soil. And the Germans, in return, asked for the ability to have access to death records, to maintain cemeteries in Russia, to be able to not create grandiose monuments or anything like that, but sites of commemoration and memory within a cemetery. And so Russia agrees to this, partially for the reciprocal access on German soil. So now that Germany has the right to do this, they get some of this information from Russian archives. And because I have some connections in Ulyanovsk, I was able to do research that I wasn't maybe necessarily able to do in other locations. And fate was kind to me when I was in the regional archive one day, and a man overheard me talking to the archivist about my studies, and he had said something about, he had his own personal journalist collection of documents at a different private archive in town. So I got to go there, and he solved the mystery I had about the history of a monument that was created in the cemetery in Ulyanovsk. So the German prisoners were buried near where the camp was in Ulyanovsk. The city expanded over time. The place where the camp had been kind of like on the outskirts of the city. Nothing happened there. The city grew. They decided to build a trolley park there. And in the process of digging the trolley park, they found the graves, were very confused, figured out what the graves were from. They dug up all the remains and interred them in the central cemetery in their own little part of the cemetery. So it's kind of, it's gated. it's not a gate. There's kind of like a fence around it to denote that this is the area where this is the communal grave for the German prisoners. But it is not like it's at a completely different place, right? There are Russian graves all around it. And then in the post-Soviet era, the Red Cross was able to come in the early 90s and erect a small monument that says, here are the in memory of the Germans who died in captivity in Ulyanovsk. And then private citizens were allowed to go back in the circa 2016, 2014, and they were able to use their own money to expand this and build more monuments there. One of the most shocking says, or not shocking, striking, says to the victims, the German victims. It doesn't say what they're a victim of. Are they a victim of Stalinism? Are they a victim of Nazism? Are they victims of both? It's very vague, but it's striking that German citizens were allowed to do this on Russian soil. So there has been a vast change in memory and access to this information.
Yes. Thank you, Susan, and congratulations on the book, and special congratulations on having discovered an aspect of the history of World War II that was not very well known about, that was definitely understudied. So congratulations on that too, and thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.